Hey there, I hope you're doing well. My name is Arya and today we're going to look at some more Reddit stories. If you enjoy Reddit stories, consider liking, subscribing, and maybe hitting that notification bell too. Let's get started with today's first story. Much love, everyone. Today's first story comes from my ex begged me to raise her affair child Scandalous. You know that scene in The Godfather, where Michael Corleone sees a stunning woman in Italy and kind of gets mesmerized. His two Sicilian bodyguards notice it and start talking about how he's been struck by the thunderbolt and fallen in love. Well, that's not just a fictional movie thing. I actually witnessed it firsthand, though. At the time I didn't understand what was happening. It happened to my wife. Unfortunately, she didn't experience that feeling when she met me. Instead, it occurred with another man. 25 years after we got married, and that marked the beginning of the end for what I thought was a perfect life, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I tend to do that when I reflect on my past life and how things were supposed to unfold, even though they didn't go as planned. I should probably start from the beginning and introduce myself. I'm Alan Gregerson, though everyone calls me Greg. I'm 50 years old and I live in a small Midwestern city about a 2-hour drive from Chicago. I work as an accountant for a fairly large national company. The job can be a bit repetitive, but the pay is good, and aside from the busy months of March and April, I usually stick to a 40-hour workweek without weekends. I was married up until 2 years ago. My ex-wife and I have a daughter together named Morgan. She's 25 now, married, has a child and lives in Denver. My marriage ended in divorce after 26 years. The first 25 years of that marriage, which I mentioned before, seemed wonderful. I met Tracy at Iowa State University in Ames, Iowa, during my sophomore year. She was also a sophomore, but she had moved into my dorm after spending her freshman year in a different one. I noticed her fit, athletic body lying on a towel outside the dorm enjoying the strong August sun of Iowa. I was walking into the dorm with some friends when I caught a glimpse of her from the corner of my eye. Hey guys, I got to run, I'm about to go introduce myself to the future Mrs. Gregerson, I jokingly announced. Both of my friends turned their attention to Tracy, following where I was looking. Wow. One of them said I heard the words, but I couldn't tell you which of my friends said it. I was completely captivated by this blonde goddess lounging on a towel in a bikini by that side of the dorm. I left my friends and approached her, but when I was about 4 feet away, she propped herself up on one elbow and signaled for me to stay away. With her other hand, I felt deflated until she spoke up. Hey dummy, you're blocking my sun. I quickly shifted about a foot to the right, allowing the sun to shine back on her. She rewarded me with a radiant smile, and at that moment I would have done anything. She asked, much better dummy, she chuckled. She didn't seem bothered by a stranger approaching her. I guess when you look as attractive as she did, it's probably a common occurrence. I introduced myself, complimented her beauty, and mustered the courage to ask her out for a date next Friday. If I say yes, will you wipe that drool off your chin? She coil-equipped. What? Oh, yes, the drool. Absolutely, it's gone now, I stammered like an awkward guy in the throes of infatuation. Well, I can tell you're not one of those smooth talkers with a line for every situation, so sure, we can go out on Friday night. I got her phone number. We went to a small Italian restaurant in Ames that Friday evening, and as I sat there, looking completely smitten, she shared every detail of her life from age 3 to the present. I think she only stopped talking because our main course was finally served. We just seemed to connect effortlessly, and within a month we were spending nearly all of our free time together. Not only was she intelligent, she was her high school's valedictorian, but she also had a playful sense of humor and a quiet self-assuredness. I thought I was a pretty decent-looking guy, not a superstar, but I was fairly athletic, earned 7 varsity letters in high school, smart, ranked in the top 5 of my high school class, and I could hold a meaningful conversation on a wide range of topics. While I wasn't one of those smooth-talking guys with a clever line for everything, I did have a reasonable amount of self-assurance. However, when I asked Tracy out, I knew I was aiming higher than my league, but hey, you don't get anything if you don't give it a shot, right? Tracy and I had our first sexual experience on our 6th date. Neither of us were innocents, but I hadn't been with more than a few partners up until that point, and I got the sense that Tracy was in a similar situation. Update: Tracy and I tied the knot shortly after we graduated. Finding jobs was easy for both of us. She became a 3rd grade teacher and I landed a job as an accountant. Our incomes were stable. We purchased a house a couple of years later, and almost a year after moving in, we welcomed our only child. A daughter named Morgan. Life was good. Our bed life, though not wildly adventurous, provided us both with plenty of satisfaction. Like many couples, the frequency of our activities did slow down a bit with time and age. However, even when Morgan left for college, we were still quite active 3 or 4 times a week. Over the years, I occasionally had moments of concern about Tracy's fidelity, but those were rare. She might mention a young teacher at her school being a bit flirty, but she never gave any indication that she reciprocated or let things go further. I figured this was just my own insecurities. I mean, I'm not blind. Tracy's still attractive and it's only natural for others to take a second glance, but that's where it ends. I made that crystal clear to Tracy from the beginning of our exclusive relationship. She responded in kind, assuring me she felt the same way. It didn't bother me if she noticed other guys as long as it never went beyond. Looking in return, I promised the same to her. That's how things were until 3 years ago. We were at our neighbor's annual summer party 3 doors down the street in our trendy neighborhood. Scott and Wendy Harris always throw a big party at their place on the weekend after the 4th of July. Tracy and I go every year, along with most of the neighbors on our block. It's always a blast. If you are enthusiastic about this narrative, please inform us. If you found the video enjoyable, please press A. If you do not have the desired option, please press B. Your feedback serves as a great source of inspiration for me to collect more uplifting and profound stories. Scott and Wendy are great hosts. There's good food and drinks. They have a big in-ground pool and a sand volleyball court. Even the people they invite from outside the neighborhood are usually nice, except for one person, but I'll get to that. The party kicks off at noon and Tracy and I showed up around 1. I went to the bar, got a white Zinfandel for Tracy and a Michelob for myself, and we started mingling. At first, we stuck together, but as conversations started flowing both inside and outside the house, we split up. It's never been a problem before. I check in with Tracy from time to time to see if she needed a drink, refill, or some snacks. Sometimes she'd come find me. We'd usually give each other a quick kiss on the lips. I was chatting with some of the guys from the neighborhood, and Tracy was across the yard, talking to a group of women. When a group of outsiders arrived, there was a man with 2 women and Scott went over to welcome them. That's when I noticed the thunderbolt hitting Tracy. I happened to glance at her after looking at the newcomers, and she had stopped talking to her friends. She was watching the new group with a look on her face that I now recognize as a mix of awe and pure attraction. I didn't fully understand the look at the time, but it was clear as she was captivated, and I have to admit my intuition started sending signals. She stared at them for about 10 seconds, then she turned toward me, locked eyes with me, and turned beet red before returning to her friends and rejoining the conversation. Have you ever had that odd feeling that something isn't quite right with the world, but you can't quite pinpoint what's wrong? That's the feeling I got about an hour later. I felt even more uneasy when I scanned the yard and couldn't spot Tracy. I grabbed a white wine for her at the bar and started searching. Eventually, I found her in the Harris's den chatting with 4 other people, including the guy she had been eyeing earlier. In fact, he had his arm casually around her, his hand resting on her hip. It looked a bit too cozy for my comfort, especially considering that she had apparently just met this guy. The 5 of them seemed to be having a friendly conversation. I'm pretty confident in myself, and I trust my wife completely. I didn't want to make a scene, but it seemed like this guy was getting too touchy with my wife. I approached the group from behind Tracy and her new friend, grabbing his wrist firmly to remove it from her hip. I don't think we've met yet, even though you seem way too comfortable with my wife, I said in a stern tone. He tried to pull away, but I had a tight grip on his wrist, keeping him in place. Tracy, who seemed a bit flushed before I joined them, turned even redder. When she saw me, "Oh Greg, please," she sort of squealed when she realized I was holding his wrist. "Greg. This is Charles Delane, he's a European literature teacher at the college. He started last year, he's French and he didn't do anything inappropriate." So I left his hand where it was. The others in the group were nodding in agreement. So I let go of Charles's wrist and shook his hand firmly, maybe a bit too tightly, as I felt a few bones crunched together. Tracy then introduced me to the rest of the group. Like an afterthought, "Thought you might need a refill," I said, handing her the wine glass while looking at Charles. "You're always so thoughtful." "My dear husband," she replied. Charles, pronounced the French way. As Charles looked like typical Eurotrash to me, I have to admit he was a decent-looking guy around 32, about 6 feet tall and 170 pounds. He had a scruffy beard and his hair was somewhere between long and needing a trim. He had a strong French accent in his English and I couldn't help but think he might be sleeping with half of his students after the introductions. He went back to talking about Victor Hugo or someone, feeling like I'd made my point. I headed back outside to the yard. Tracy and Charles joined the sand volleyball game in the backyard. I was usually quite competitive in these matches and we played a lot as the winner's court. Many people watched from the safety of the deck, and that's where my wife and Charles settled. I was focused on the game, so I couldn't pay too much attention to them, but I did notice plenty of touching, smiling, and even a few blushes from Tracy. Every so often I'd wave to her and she'd wave back. My team had been winning several games and still had control of the court. An hour later, when I realized that Tracy and Charles weren't in their seats anymore, I looked around the bar and grill area. But they weren't there either. My gut feeling was really strong, so I asked one of the other guys to take my place, joking that my 47-year-old legs were tired and I needed a beer badly. They teased me about being an old man as I left the sand to keep up appearances. I headed to the bar and grabbed another Me Club. I wandered around the yard for a bit and then went into the house. I checked every open room and listened carefully at the closed doors, but I couldn't see or hear Tracy or Charles. I eventually went over to the hostess, Wendy, and casually asked if she had seen my wife recently. "Yeah. She and Charles went to his car to check something, I think," Wendy said casually. "What car does he drive?" I asked with a hint of irritation. That's when Wendy seemed to realize something. "We've been friends for over 15 years, she looked concerned and replied. "It's a gray Saab." I stepped outside and glanced down the street. No sign of a Saab. Wendy joined me in the driveway. "I'm sure it's nothing, Greg," she said in a soothing tone. "They might have just gone to the college for a moment." "Yeah, thanks, probably nothing," I replied without much certainty and walked away. The local college was only a 5-minute drive from home. I decided to check it out myself. I drove to the school and searched through all of their parking lots. No sign of the Saab. I called Tracy's cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail, suggesting she was either talking to someone else or her phone was off. I left a message over the next hour. I left her 4 more messages. While sitting at home, I also reached out to her parents and sister to ask if they had heard from her. They all said no. It reminded me of a Sherlock Holmes quote: "Once you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the truth." I settled into my lazy boy chair in the family room and stared at the blank large screen for hours. I didn't even need to turn on the TV because the images were playing in my mind. My beautiful wife with that French guy. Seriously. Why did we bother saving that country in 2 world wars? We should have just let the Germans have it. I didn't get any sleep that night. I just sat in the chair fixating on the TV. I half expected Tracy to sneak into the house during the night. But when that didn't happen, I started to think that maybe Charles had been in a car accident with Tracy. In the car around 8 a.m. I called the local sheriff's office, identified myself and asked if there were any accidents during the night. They said no. I dialed Tracy's phone 4 more times and got no response. Each time as noon approached, I heard a car pull into the driveway and someone got out, as indicated by the door shutting. About 45 seconds later, Tracy used her key to open the door and walked in a few seconds later. She saw me in the family room and quietly took a seat on the sofa across the room. If I had any doubts about what they had been up to, those were quickly shattered by her appearance. At least she had the decency to have showered before returning. Her long blonde hair, which was down yesterday, was now pulled back into a damp ponytail. She had no makeup on and her skin on her chest, shoulders and arms had a rosy glow. She had the contented look of someone who had a satisfying time, and I'll admit she looked stunning, but she wasn't showing any remorse or guilt. If anything, she seemed to have a smug smirk on her face. Nice of you to finally show up. Have a good time last night, and this morning, I said with a sneer. Well, actually I did. She responded smugly. That wasn't exactly the answer I was expecting. Listen, Greg, she continued calmly. Have you ever felt an incredible physical and emotional connection with someone from the moment you met them? Something almost electric, amazing and wonderful. Yeah. I have, I replied immediately. I married that woman. Her calm facade shattered with my response. Her composed expression gave way to recognition of my pain. Yesterday, I met my person like that. I can't explain it. I just have to be with him. I love him just like that. Are you out of your mind? I yelled. You're throwing away 25 years of marriage for a feeling. Did I mean absolutely nothing to you? I'm not sure why she was surprised by my outburst. She began sobbing uncontrollably in response, but I didn't care. I do love you, Greg, she finally choked out. Our time together has been wonderful, but this connection I feel now is unlike anything I've ever experienced. I love you, but I'm in love with him. It's amazing, amazing, huh? Well, take some time to appreciate that, and then maybe we can celebrate with a party. I spattered her. So are you planning to file for divorce, or should I continued? Either way, it'll be an even split and we can sell the house and divide that money too. I was the one getting frustrated now. What I complained, that's not how this works. You don't get to keep me as a backup plan. If you're with him, then go be with him as soon as you want. As far as I'm concerned, we were over when you got together with him. The first time yesterday, you continuing with him just strengthens my decision. But she stammered. All right, then I'll handle the divorce proceedings and I'll be out of here. By the end of the week, I kept my word and moved my belongings out of the house by the end of the week. I took a couple of days off from work to make it happen. One evening, while I was loading my pickup truck, Scott and Wendy Harris walked down the street and apologized for inviting Charles to their party. I stopped them politely, explaining that they couldn't have known Tracy would react this way. Still, we feel responsible, Wendy said, looking down. My attorney drafted the divorce papers and Tracy was served within a month. It seemed she thought I'd drag my feet, so my lawyer told me the process server reported. She was furious when she received the papers. That probably explains why she showed up at my new apartment 2 days later, ringing the doorbell and barging in when I answered. How could you do this? If you love me, she shouted as she entered my place. At first, I was taken aback, but anger quickly took over. Are you seriously not getting it? I yelled back. You're with another guy. What did you expect me to do? Maybe I love you, and if things don't work out with him, what am I supposed to do then? Just wait for you to come back. Give me some time. If this doesn't pan out, I'll come back to you and be the perfect wife. We can still have a future together. You're not seeing reality. I retorted. I'm not giving you permission to have your affair and then come back if it doesn't work out, and if he's truly your dream guy, why wouldn't it work out? Charles is in the process of divorcing his wife and they're sorting out financial matters. She started. In other words, he might be Mr. Right for you, but the feeling might not be mutual. I questioned more, stumbling over her words, followed before I finally told her to leave my apartment if she wanted to continue her affair or I'd kick her out. Tracy and her lawyer did whatever they could to slow down the divorce proceedings. Meanwhile, Mr. Wonderful moved into my former house, effectively taking my place. Update 1. 4 months later, I'm leaving Chez Michelle's with a colleague after a business dinner, and I see a familiar face. Actually, two approaching the door. It was Charles and a visibly pregnant Tracy. She seemed to be about 3 months pregnant. I stopped in my tracks, staring and blocking their way into the restaurant. "Oh my God," I muttered quietly. My colleague had also halted, looking quite puzzled. As the four of us stood face to face, Serge meet my wife for a little while longer and her boyfriend Charles Delane, I introduced with a touch of sarcasm. Serge had the awkward duty of remaining polite in this uncomfortable situation. I thought he handled it as well as possible. He stammered, "She's pregnant." "Is it yours?" "That's definitely his," I replied cheerfully. "You're such a jerk, Greg." "You know that," she retorted as she and Charles passed us and entered the restaurant later. Wendy Harris informed me that Tracy was indeed 3 months pregnant. It turned out Charles was such a wonderful guy that Tracy wanted to have his child and went off birth control. Best of luck with that, I told Wendy. The divorce was eventually finalized. A few months later, and 2 months after that, Tracy gave birth to a son. Of course, they named him Charles Jr., because when you're so amazing, what better way to express it than by naming another person after yourself? Our daughter, Morgan, wasn't exactly pleased with Tracy's choice to have another child at this stage of life, especially since her parents weren't together and I wasn't the father. I'll admit, I felt proud of Morgan for taking my side in this messy situation, though I knew she had the baby. I hadn't spoken to Tracy or seen her since that encounter at the restaurant many months back. I knew it was bound to happen eventually, given we both lived in the same town. However, I have to confess I was quite surprised. The first time I laid eyes on Tracy after she had given birth, the added weight didn't suit her well, and it appeared the whole experience had taken a toll on her 49-year-old body. I almost walked right past the woman who seemed like a grandmother pushing a stroller with a 1-year-old boy inside at the local mall. "Come on, Greg, there's no need to be rude," a voice I recognized all too well said, as I hurried past them on a Saturday afternoon. I abruptly halted and, despite my attempt not to, I did a slow double take at the woman and the baby. Oh no, this was Tracy and her son. "Hey there, stranger," I managed to say, as I gathered my thoughts. "Hey yourself," she replied. The baby was undeniably cute. He had Tracy's hair and eye color, but bore his father's slightly darker complexion. "Wow, Mom, he's adorable," I genuinely remarked. Tracy blushed slightly and graciously thanked me. "I haven't seen you in a while," and well, pushing a stroller, I added, attempting to apologize for not recognizing her immediately. Although she visibly flinched at my apology, she chose to let it slide without comment. While I found her incredibly attractive after Morgan's birth many years ago, she was over 20 years older now, and since this baby wasn't mine, I suppose my hormones were quite under control. We chatted pleasantly for a few more minutes, mostly about her lack of sleep, and I sensed a genuine note of sadness, something she had never shown after Morgan's birth. I eventually excused myself, offering apologies, and went on with my shopping, which had been my original intent. I saw Tracy again at the Harris's summer party about 6 months later. Scott and Wendy always felt bad that Tracy met Charles at their party, but I assured them that I didn't blame them for her bad choices. Still, Wendy kept trying to set me up with her single and divorced friends, and I have to admit some of those setups were pretty decent. They kept inviting me to their annual summer party, and even though I had skipped the last two, I decided to go this time, even though they warned me that Tracy and Charles would be there too. I assured them that if any issues arose, I wouldn't be the one causing them, and I meant it. I was at the party for a couple of hours when I noticed Tracy and Charles entering the backyard since the baby wasn't with them. I assumed they had left the baby with a babysitter. Tracy had shed some of her pregnancy weight and didn't look as much like a grandmother as she did the last time I saw her. Still, I couldn't ignore the sadness in her once bright blue eyes. Even when she smiled, there was something missing in her gaze. I addressed the elephant in the room early on by approaching Tracy and Charles, giving her a light hug and shaking his hand. I think both of them were a bit surprised, and I could swear I saw Wendy holding her breath as I walked over to them. We chatted briefly for maybe a minute. Then I excused myself and returned to my group of friends by the grill when the sand volleyball game started. I joined one of the teams. We played the second game, and while I was on the court, I noticed Tracy sitting in a chair watching and cheering. I didn't see Mr. Wonderful anywhere around after 2 games. We lost the second one, so we had to leave the court and wait for our next turn. While I was getting a beer, I glanced over at Tracy sitting alone. Some things never change, I thought to myself. I grabbed my drink and headed indoors. The third room I checked happened to be the den, and sure enough, my instincts were right on target. Charles had his arm around Marilyn Jansen's waist, while talking in a small group, and Marilyn was looking at him with obvious desire in her eyes. Marilyn used to live down the street from me, and she was undoubtedly married. I should have just kept to myself. I thought, if this is what I suspect, he's going to hook up with this woman tonight and cheat on Tracy. If I don't say anything, I'm in the wrong. If I do tell her, there's going to be trouble and I'll still be in the wrong. A true friend would talk to her, but I wasn't a true friend, I was her ex-husband. Why should I even be responsible for this? But then fate intervened and made the decision for me. Marilyn's husband, Troy, was on my sand volleyball team and apparently followed me inside to discuss some strategy. He saw the same thing I did. Charles with his arm around his wife and her looking at Charles like he's the best thing since sliced bread. You jerk, get your hands off my wife, he yelled at Charles as he lunged towards them. I started to step in to prevent a fight, but then common sense prevailed and I let my volleyball teammate rush past me before Charles could pull away from Troy's wife. Troy had grabbed Charles's arm. They returned about 10 minutes later with 2 police officers. The cops took statements from everyone present in the room at the time, just in case Charles wanted to press charges against Troy Jansen. The older officer, Sergeant Jim Hilt, seemed to be around my age. The younger officer was Officer Kathleen McDonald, who appeared to be in her 40s and every bit as Irish as her name suggested, with her freckles, green eyes, and long red hair. I made sure to go over to Officer McDonald's side so I could give my statement to her. Amidst this commotion, Tracy was in tears. Officer McDonald noticed Tracy waiting for me and questioned me next. I explained what I saw and added that Charles had stolen my wife at this very party 3 years ago. She seemed surprised by my remark. And you're still going to take her to the hospital for him? She asked. Are you that nice or just a complete idiot? Got to admit that caught me off guard. I looked at her face and saw her trying not to smile. Definitely a complete idiot, I replied. She didn't see that response coming either and let out a small laugh. I kind of liked that sound. After answering a couple more questions, I was done giving my statement. She said I could take Tracy to the hospital, but before I left she warned me that Tracy might not believe my story. If I told her, don't count on her believing me, I replied as I began to turn away. She started to move on to the next person for a statement, but a quick thought popped into my head and then out of my mouth. Maybe you should give me your card in case. I remember something else, officer. She grinned back at me, her eyes practically lighting up. She took a card from her uniform shirt's top left pocket, flipped it over and jotted down what seemed to be her personal phone number. Thanks, officer, I chuckled at her, then put on a determined expression and turned to Tracy. Let's go on the way to the hospital. Tracy asked me what happened to Charles. I told her the truth, fully expecting her not to believe me. Can't you just move on, Greg? She complained. It's been 3 years now. It's not about moving on, Tracy, I replied. Charles shouldn't have been getting handsy with Marilyn Jansen, and Troy was right to step in. Maybe if I'd been that assertive, you and I might still be together. Neither of us expected those words to come out of my mouth. Tracy's eyes welled up with tears before she turned her head away from me. In the pickup, I dropped Tracy off at the and didn't go inside with her. She'd need to get an Uber back to the small home she shared with Charles, since we sold our house and split the money after the divorce. With her out of sight for the night, I reached into my shirt pocket for the card Officer Kathleen McDonald had given me earlier. A nice girl, I thought to myself, trying to play it cool. I waited 3 days before calling Officer Kathleen McDonald. She picked up on the second ring. Could you have taken any longer? I could be engaged and married by now. She teased over the phone. Guess you're right, but if you're that speedy, you might miss out on becoming the next and last Mrs. Alan Gregerson, I retorted. Now who's getting sassy? She retorted. How do you know I'll even agree when you ask me out? And no, I don't want to go to some Irish pub for a date. Her Irish pub remark caught me off guard because, honestly, that's what I had in mind. It seemed like a fitting idea to take an Irish girl to an Irish pub. She sensed my hesitation and nailed it. What's the deal with you guys? Can any of you think outside the box? You see red hair and you automatically think Irish pub. I stumbled for a moment before coming up with my plan B. Our city had an amazing Greek restaurant that I adored, and Greek cuisine was a far cry from Irish. She took only a split second to respond positively. Thanks for switching things up a bit. She said, once I reject the Irish pub, most guys default to Asian. Sorry, but I'm not into food that could pass for a cockroach haven. I burst out laughing at that, and I think that's when I realized I might have found someone to spend my life with. We talked for another hour, covering a wide range of topics. I found out she was actually 45 and had been divorced for a decade. Her ex also had fidelity issues. She had a son who was a sophomore at Michigan State studying pre-law. Our Saturday night dinner was incredible, and the company was even better. I picked her up at her house on the south side of town and was taken aback by how stunning my lovely girl looked in her little black dress and 4-inch heels. All the right curves, great legs, a pretty face, and that vibrant red hair. She was a living definition of gorgeous. We had one of those conversations that meandered through all kinds of subjects. I could have listened to her voice all night. She didn't seem eager to rush into marriage. Just like I wasn't in a hurry to tie the knot. This made her both relaxed and intriguing, as her naturally inquisitive nature shone through like that of a cop. She asked thought-provoking questions, showing she was thinking. As she listened to my answers, I drove her back home after dinner. I didn't invite her inside my place, and she didn't extend an invitation either. We exchanged good nights on her doorstep, and then she leaned in for a gentle kiss on my cheek. I'm pretty sure I turned 3 shades of red, wished her good night, and floated back to my car. The drive home is a blur in my memory. Gosh. I felt like a teenager again. Her lips on my cheek were soft, and I'm quite certain she was wearing White Shoulders perfume. She called me up on Sunday morning asking if I wanted to join her for bagels and lox at her place. How could I possibly turn down that invitation? Wendy and Scott asked me over for dinner a few days later, partly to apologize for everything that happened and also to get my side of the story. Turns out Charles was threatening to sue them, as well as Troy Jansen. This guy must think he's a real catch. Scott blurted out at one point he's quite good-looking, dear, and quite charming. I have to admit that Wendy said before Scott shot her a glare that could melt steel. Troy spent the whole weekend in jail before getting bailed out on Monday morning. According to what the Harrises said, when he got back home, Marilyn and their 2 kids were nowhere to be found. They had gone to stay with her mother in another town. Scott mentioned that their 12-year marriage was likely over. Well, pass along my number to Troy and let him know that I more than anyone understand what he's dealing with. I'll be there. If you want someone to talk to, and I've got his back when this goes to court, we'll let him know, and I'm sure he'll appreciate that. Scott Harris said, by the way, this was our last summer fling. I can't handle this kind of drama. As Scott spoke, Wendy's gaze was fixed on her plate of peas. I got the sense that things weren't going so well in Harrisland since the party update a few months later, when 47-year-old Wendy started showing a baby bump in public. My suspicions were confirmed. I didn't need to guess who the likely father was because Scott himself called me to spill the beans. Can you believe this? He practically shouted into the phone. When I answered, that jerk got my wife pregnant. She's been having an affair with that guy since last year's party. Scott told me he had no clue until Wendy started getting sick every other morning, just like she did when she was pregnant with their 2 kids years ago. When Scott confronted her about it, she confessed that she and Charles had been having an affair for over a year, though most of the time they used protection. They ran out of it during a long weekend when they both managed to sneak away from home and stay at a motel, They thought a few times without protection wouldn't hurt. Then Scott asked me for the name of my attorney. Can I at least get a friends and family discount? He joked in a dry tone. Charles and Wendy had apparently moved into an apartment near the campus, leaving Tracy and her son on their own. According to Scott, not my issue, I replied, but I hadn't taken the female perspective into account. While I was having lunch at a nearby McDonald's, she came up to my table. Holding her son's hand, she set her lunch tray on the table across from me, and the little one quickly settled into the seat beside me. "Hi Tracy, hi CJ." I greeted the two. The little child, now around 3 years old, extended a clean hand for a proper handshake. I was impressed by how mature he was trying to be so. I shook his tiny hand firmly with mine. "Hi there, sir." He greeted me in his most serious voice. "Hello, Greg," Tracy added. "He's growing up fast," I remarked to Tracy, glancing at her son. "You might end up with a tall one on your hands in the future." I could tell by Tracy's expression that she appreciated my attempt to be civil. However, there was something bothering her that was clear from her face, and if she didn't address it soon, it seemed like she might burst. "Go ahead and ask me," I encouraged her gently, watching her son unwrap a cheeseburger. "Did you ever truly love me as much as you claimed?" She began softly. "Because if you did, then why didn't you fight for me, like Troy did for Marilyn? Why didn't you ask me to come back like someone who genuinely loved me would have? Why haven't you visited my house to check on us, or even invited us over for an evening?" I wasn't expecting that at all. Suddenly this was being put on me. I took a deep breath and shook my head. I wanted to stay composed and avoid an angry confrontation, while I exhaled slowly. "So this is all my fault? Seriously? I'm the one who did wrong here, you're the innocent party." My voice started to rise. As I spoke, this wasn't what I intended. I wanted. No, I needed to make my point. Whoa, I exhaled again, holding up my hand to pause. "If you remember, I removed Charles's hand from your waist, but you insisted that nothing was happening and I shouldn't cause any trouble. I trusted you completely and believed your word, so I didn't push further. Excuse me for having so much trust in you. If I had known then what I know now, I wouldn't have trusted you. I would have confronted him like Troy did, but you, the person I trusted the most in the world, lied to me. So I didn't fight for you. Then, when you came home the next day around noon, what could I do? The damage was already done. It was quite obvious, so what was there to fight about? At that point you had given yourself to another man and broken our vows. There was nothing left for me to fight, for you made it very clear. You made it crystal clear. This was your decision alone, and I had no say in it. So what was there to fight about? You were no longer mine, you were his, but you didn't even try to change my mind. She complained or make an effort to make me stay. Nothing. If you truly loved me, how many times did you sleep with Charles that first night? And in the morning, I bet it was multiple times. I stated once was a huge mistake. Maybe forgivable twice was a deliberate choice, and more than that was you shattering my heart into pieces, and you had the audacity to tell me you had a fantastic time, an incredible connection, if I recall correctly, and that you and he had this almost magical bond. You didn't show any remorse. You know, lust and soul share the same letters. So what were my options, as the saying goes? If you love something, let it go. If it comes back, it's yours. If not, it never was. I continued, and then, just to add insult to injury, you have his child at 48. I couldn't even convince you to have a second child in 25 years, but not only did you readily embrace Mr. Wonderful, but you let him impregnate you. So this is all about your wounded male pride. She responded a bit snippier than I'd prefer. I reacted quickly, but with her child at the table, I held back from taking the bait. No, what you chose to do once you were with him was your decision. You loved him enough to have his baby, even though you refused that with me. I got the message loud and clear. We ate quietly for a few minutes. She seemed unsure. I knew where the conversation was headed, but someone had to bring it up. "So, what's your plan now?" I finally inquired. "You and Charles never got married, but he's acknowledged as the child's father, right? At the very least, you should pursue child support from him. I'll let Wendy deal with him. Tracy replied, but you're right. I should demand child support from that cheater. That's good advice. Do you ever wonder about us? Sometimes, she added what might have been honestly. No, I replied in a hushed tone. You shattered my heart so completely that I never wanted to imagine what could have been. There are some wonderful memories from our past that I'll always cherish, but that chapter is closed and there's no going back. We continued eating and I observed the young boy playing with his fries. It reminded me of our daughter Morgan when she was that age. He seems like a good kid. I'm glad something positive came out of that relationship, I remarked, even though we started with that intense connection. In the end, we never truly bonded the way you and I did. Our early days were passionate. I won't deny that, but we never grew together. As a couple, love couldn't replace the initial desire. When that passion faded, it seemed to dawn on her at that moment, an epiphany of sorts. She shook her head with a tinge of sadness, tears forming in her eyes. She traded the warmth and security of love for the fleeting spark of lust, just like lightning. It had its brilliant moment before disappearing. My bonny lass and I just celebrated our 10th wedding anniversary with a trip to an unexpected destination. Spain. I jokingly suggested a visit to her homeland, but after playfully hitting me hard enough to leave a mark, she opted for a warmer and spicier location. Our relationship can be described as warmer and spicier too. We have a few more years of work left before retiring from the cybersecurity firm we co-founded. Since my shift from engineering and her exit from the police force to start the company, things have gone remarkably well. We're nearly inseparable, both in business and in our personal lives. Yet the magic hasn't faded. It might sound cliché, but I think I fall for her a bit more each day between the two of us. We now have 5 grandchildren. Despite one branch of the family residing in Denver, Colorado and the other in Houston, Texas, we manage to see them regularly. I occasionally bump into Tracy around town, but our conversations rarely exceed a few sentences. She's busy being a mom to CJ, who's around 13. Now, to my knowledge, she hasn't remarried and seldom dates. My daughter, who occasionally talks to her, shares this. It appears Mr. Wonderful had to be coerced into paying child support consistently, even facing legal intervention. Her life seems somewhat bleak, lacking many luxuries, but everyone makes their choices and has to live with the consequences. I won't apologize for moving on with my life. I'm going to turn this one over to you. What do you make of this situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, a huge thank you from the bottom of my heart for getting involved in today's stories. Your love, support, and time mean the world to me. So, thank you so much for being part of this. I really appreciate your time. I'll see you in the next one. Take care and much love.